Hello, everyone. I just bring warm regards from Israel, where I was for 2 weeks, in the hotbed of activity going on there, the battles. I don't know if any of you visited there recently, but I would definitely encourage everyone to go, simply to show support for our own brothers and sisters who are being attacked simply for only one reason, because they're Jewish, which would mean that technically that if any of us were there, we would be the same type of targets. So it was very gratifying for me to be there, because I felt the solidarity and the unity of being together. And as Jews usually work out, there's no panic going on, but at the same time everyone is a high alert and very sensitive. And I felt therefore appropriate to talk about the events going on in Israel and Middle East in general, titling this class Full Moon over Gaza. The reason I say that is because yesterday was the 15th of the month of the Hebrew month of Av, which is considered a holiday because it's the full moon of this month. So you know the Hebrew calendar works by the lunar cycles, with the new moon being the first day of the month, and the 15th of the month, the full moon, is the full moon. And holidays, the Jewish holidays, all orbit around the moon. For example, Passover and Sukkot are always the 15th of the month, the full moon. Rosh Hashanah is always a new moon, as a new year. So the Talmud tells us that on this 15th of this month particularly, the full moon is considered to be a great holiday, comparable actually to Yom Kippur, which itself is quite amazing to compare a 15th of this month to Yom Kippur, which I'll discuss a little later. So the reason for this is because the moon has its own mystical power, and a full moon represents fullness, a fullness of energy, a vibe that is very positive, and especially for the Jewish people who count by the moon, and we are compared to the moon. The Jewish nation throughout history has been like the moon, waxing and waning, and just as it's about to be annihilated, it's just reborn again. So that's why we sanctify the moon every month. We bless the moon, and the moon becomes a symbol. And it actually goes all the way back to the Bible, when the Jews left Egypt. So the first statement that God told Moses was, took him outside in the streets of Alexandria of Egypt and said to him, "Look up into the heavens. This will be the new moon to you. And just as the moon is renewed, you as a nation, the Jewish people, will always be renewed." And ever since, we bless that moon once a month. But of all the months in the year, when is the full moon at its greatest peak? This month, because it's also the month where a few days earlier we honored and we commemorated the destruction of the temples on the 9th of Av. So as the Arizal, the holy Arizal, the great mystic from Tzfat, puts it, he says, in direct proportion to the descent is the ascent, which is really a tremendous lesson in life, that even when we fall or we have setbacks and we have failures or losses, every loss is meant to bring a greater gain, a greater profit. And since the greatest loss, the greatest destruction in the moon, meaning affecting the Jewish people, was in this month, on the 9th of Av, so therefore the full moon of this month he considers to be the greatest holiday, because it represents fullness. You know, it's one thing when everything is going well and you celebrating, but it's another when you're about to be destroyed and you see the temples destroyed, the Jews exiled, Jerusalem, Israel under attack, and you still see a full moon. That's a symbol that nothing can vanquish us. And that's why the full moon of this month represents far more than just fullness, as in other months it has this particular power, which I shall elaborate upon more. But the thing that struck me very interestingly is this. The world more or less is condemning Israel for defending itself, but nothing new about that. There's no nation in the world that would be considering civilian casualties if they're under attack. Put President Putin in charge of Israel for 6 months and you won't have any problems. And no one will condemn him, not in the UN and not in the United States. But Israel, for some reason, is under a double standard, whether it's anti-Semitism, which many people associate very clearly, because, just to take a case in point, in Pakistan, as we speak, over 1 million Muslims have been displaced, and tens of thousands have been killed. because the Pakistanis feel that they're terrorists. Most of you probably don't even know that. Now, it doesn't make a headline, doesn't even make a footnote in the newspaper. So explain to me how you talk about disproportionate reaction, disproportionate reporting. So I know I'm biased. I'm speaking as a Jew, as pro-Israel, obviously. But the mere fact, I just read a lecture that someone from Sudan gave at the Durban conference and said that he's not a particular Jew lover, but the mere fact that 80% of condemnations in the UN is against Israel is essentially a disservice to all the minorities that are being persecuted all over the world, because no one focuses on them. Everyone's focusing on Israel. So it's an interesting twist on the whole discrimination thing. So I'm non-apologetic and non-defensive. I don't have any issue at all with having to feel that we have to compromise or, an aggressor is an aggressor. If you call someone a terrorist nation or a terrorist group who calls for your annihilation, tell me, would you sit down and negotiate with someone that says, I want to destroy you? It's ridiculous. It's a non-starter. The mere fact that Israel even considers that, to me, is insanity. But so be it. So I'm not here to defend or feel the need to defend Israel. But when you see events like this going on, and then as I was packing literally on last Thursday, which was right after Tisha B'Av, and I was on my way back to the United States, so I was watching President Obama announcing that he's going to he's going to bomb ISIS in Iraq. And I remember saying to myself, wow, that's like a miracle. Because ISIS, which stands for the Islamic State for Iraq and Syria, or some call it ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. Levant is the whole Middle East. Basically has the same charter and the same principles as Hamas, as those Hezbollah, as Al-Qaeda, and a few other such militant, whatever the different names people call them, jihadists, militants, terrorists, murderers, all these names. And it's interesting that the United States feels it important to bomb them, and they don't see the same. And no one seems to see the parallel that you could be bombing Hamas and Gaza for the same reasons. They have the same policies, the same principles, that you attack even innocent people. And the ultimate goal is a Muslim caliph, as they put it, a Muslim control over the Middle East, which is what they feel is their religious beliefs. So I found it to be almost like, I thought it was like somewhat of a miracle that here, and it's tragic to see the beheadings and the brutality that this ISIS, in the name of God, in the name of religion, are perpetrating against Christians. And it's like we're back in the Middle Ages. It's like back in the future, they call it, back into the future. The Middle Ages, where literally they're giving an ultimatum to a group of religious people, in this case Christians, that either you convert or you'll be beheaded. And the United States finally felt the need to do something about it. Literally while the battles are raging in Gaza. So to me, this was all like a full moon type of effect on what's happening. And I think it's important to step back and understand these events, especially in historical context. I also find it very fascinating that it's now 13 years since September 11th. Now, September 11th brought this whole battle to the United States, when the terrorists first flew the planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And that morning, you probably all remember that Monday morning here in New York and on the East Coast, suddenly, for the first time, the war, what some call the clash of civilizations of the Muslim world, or at least the militant Muslim world, came to these shores. Now, I know since then, thank God, there has not been another terrorist attack on the mainland, the United States, and God should bless us all. We should never have another one. But it's not like the problem went away. Let's be very honest. 13 years ago, the problem didn't go away. You still have 1.5 billion Muslims on the earth, and by no means do I suggest that all of them are of this belief, but that's a breeding ground. I think as President Bush or someone said, he said, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. That's a breeding ground. It's a breeding ground for militant and for aggressive. And look, frankly, let's be very blunt and honest. Hitler was not the majority of Germany, but he was voted in, and the majority went along with him. So it makes no difference if the majority doesn't agree, but the majority goes along, or the majority tolerates. And people have to be accountable. The 100 million Germans are accountable, even if it was only Hitler and his people, because he was in control, he was elected, and they did nothing about it. That's how we look at things. So you're complicit. So I'm not here suggesting that every Muslim wants to hurt anyone, but the fact of the matter, that part of the world is a breeding ground for what's going on. And we live in a very comfortable United States where we just want to be left alone. We want to let us watch our football, eat our hot dogs, barbecue. We're getting ready for Labor Day. We've got to go to the Hamptons. We have a lot of parties to do. So we want to be left alone. We want to go back to our movies and our Hollywood and so on. That reality that September 11th woke us up to, most of us are not interested in it. So most of us don't focus on the fact that you have a boiler plate. That's not the right word. A combustion chamber in the Middle East, and the fact that it erupts once in a while is not an accident. It means it's constantly ready to erupt. Look at the civil wars going on in most of the Middle Eastern countries, and even those countries that are still relatively quiet, it's just a matter because the people in control are powerful enough to keep the people at bay. But minorities, who controls Saudi Arabia? Also a minority rulership. So we're living in a world, especially in the Middle East, that is filled with, it's a complete combustion chamber. It's like any moment things can explode there. And most of us are not interested in hearing that because it's too frightening. But Israel is at the brunt of it because it's smack in the middle, and Jews have always been the brunt of it. In disproportionate way, more news about Israel than almost any other country in the world. So I want to discuss what's going on, like what is behind the scenes here. And as I said about September 11th, I remember people here were conflicted with the same thing. After September 11th, I can tell you the United States, the big books that started selling till this day, all books about Islam, about that part of the world, are big sellers because people are very intrigued, but people still don't know. Why was America attacked? Can anyone tell? Any of you know why was the United States attacked on September 11th? Usually when someone attacks you, there's a reason. As diabolical and as obscene as Hitler, Yimach Shemo, was, he had a goal. He wanted a pure Aryan race to control the world, annihilate all Jews, and they should have the Lebanon's room. They should be the controlling force, the superior Aryan race. That's what Hitler wanted. And he was not ashamed of saying it. It was very clear his goals, and he was going to go to war and conquer every country that stands in his way. And he almost succeeded. Had he not made a few key blunders, he would have probably succeeded, God forbid. But what did the people, the Al-Qaeda movement, Bin Laden and so on, want when they attacked the United States? They weren't coming to control America. This wasn't like a first attack that led to a whole second attack to control this country. It wasn't to get money. It wasn't to get our goods. What was it? Essentially, it was a religious attack. As they made it very clear, it was to demonstrate that the secular Western world that is decadent and corrupt needs to be humiliated and needs to be demonstrated that you are not going to dominate this world. And they did it in a very crazy way, but they did it. And most of us don't relate to that. Like, what was the goal? What was the point? We were building now. The Freedom Tower is almost finished. So is it about the building? And when you here, if you read closely the documentation, and I've read the Constitution of Hamas, and I've read the Constitution of ISIS, I've read what's their mission statement. What do they see? They see Islam as being God's chosen people to transform this world into a divine home. It's actually a very spiritual vision. The only addition is that they're ready to do it aggressively. So do you think when they behead people they're just criminals? No, they really believe that they're doing what God wants. As obscene as I said, that as it sounds, they feel it's a divine act, and they're on a divine mission, as crazy as it is to us. So you have to start saying to yourself, where did this come from? Who taught them this? Now we know Islam is an outgrowth of Judaism, just as Christianity is. So they learn it from Jews. And Abraham is the father of all the nations. It says, Avram Av Hamoin Goyim is the father of all nations. His son Ishmael is the ancestor of the Ishmaelites, which is the Arab Muslim world today. His grandson Esau is the grandfather, the ancestor of the Roman Christian Western world. And his son and grandson Isaac and Jacob, respectively, are the ancestors of the Jewish people. So these battles that we're seeing now did not begin today. They didn't begin 100 years ago. They didn't begin 1,000 years ago. They began 3,800 years ago in a tent called the Tent of Abraham, Abraham's tent. And his children were fighting then, and their children continued to fight. Then it was just individuals. It was a man called Ishmael, a man called Isaac, a man called Esau, a man called Jacob. Today it became nations, because each of them gave birth to nations. Today we have a Jewish nation, you have a Christian nation, a Christian people, and you have the Muslim nations. And now there are millions and millions. The Jews always remain the minority, or 14, 15 million. Muslims are 1.5 billion Muslims, and 2.5 billion Christians. It's a pretty sizable number. Together it's 4 billion people of the 7 billion people on this planet. It's more than half the planet. And as some have already pointed out, that we are going through a clash of civilizations. But I want to put it in the Torah context. What exactly is this clash? And this is not just meant to be some type of academic discussion. It's really meant to be an understanding when you know the forces at work. Number one, it becomes easier to relate to. And number two, you could perhaps look for solutions. And I think this is something not addressed at all. All the news is dominated. Did bombs fall today? Did they not fall today? Why are they falling? Are they going to go in with a ground attack or not a ground attack? Is the food packages getting to the minorities there or not? These are all, the news developments day to day, ground to day. This has nothing to do with the bird's eye view. It's not the big picture. And it's sad that our leaders don't have a picture altogether. You tell me, do you think there's a vision that President Obama is offering? At best, he's saying we got to do something to protect against genocide. It's very noble. But what's the vision here? Do we have a goal? What's the goal? And I think you can't define a goal if you don't understand what are the forces really at work here. So I've mentioned this a number of times. I remember reading after 9/11. 9/11. I was reading the documents that the people who actually manned those planes that went into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and the one that fell in the field in Pennsylvania, crashed in that field there. I was reading what were they reading the night before they went on these death missions. So we know they also did some other things that night. It wasn't so nice to talk about, but they also were reading religious documents. And when you read them, you think you would never know these are people about to go next morning, hijack planes, with intention, knowing they're going to their deaths, and the deaths of as many thousands that they can kill. It was a miracle it was only 3,500 people. It's also a tragedy. But on a Monday morning, 9 a.m., in downtown Manhattan, it could have been 30,000 people, God forbid, easily. And so I was reading, what were they reading? So this goes back to bin Laden, who was by no means a criminal from some prison, some malcontent, some social misfit. He came from an elite Saudi Arabian princely family, highly educated, had all the money in the world. So it wasn't like someone, had grievances. What drove these people? What drives these people? And ask yourself, why don't you do you even care? The reason I submit most Americans don't really think about it is because, as I said, we've been living comfortable, illusionary lives, and we don't want to be woken up, basically. And secondly, we also like things like cowboys and Indians. We're a quick fix here. Cowboy, the good, the bad, let's get it done. Because let's be honest, we haven't fought any battles, most of us. The battles we see are on television, movies. So we want this also to be like a movie. Okay, the bad guys, we've got to kill the bad guys. But you're dealing with something more than just bad guys. You're dealing with a whole Middle East. You're dealing with countries after countries who control a tremendous amount of wealth and oil, etc., etc. So what is driving? What's bothering them? Why don't they care about just bringing up their families and happy families? Why are they busy with trying to attack America? Now busy trying to attack others. What do they want? I was driving in a cab in Israel last week, and the cab driver in Hebrew tells me, what do they want from us? What did we do to them? And we're not talking about something, I know that many of you may have been brainwashed and you think that Israel is an occupier and so on. What about 1948? We're also occupiers. 1948, the UN basically gave a few little slivers of land, if you look on the map, a few slivers of land to Israel. And immediately all the 5 or 6 Arab countries surrounding Israel went to war. What do they want? What's the matter? What's the problem?
Excuse us.
What do they want? So I was reading the documents, and one of the great the godfathers, you can say, and founders, scholars of Muslim, let's call it extremism, is a man called Katab. It's spelled Qutb, Qatb. He actually was executed by President Nasser of Egypt in 1968. President Nasser was the leader of Egypt during the 6-Day War. He was a rabid anti-Semite, was the leader basically of the war against Israel in the 6-Day War, where of course Israel won in 6 days in the most miraculous fashion. So Katab is a scholar, wrote I believe a 70-volume commentary on the Quran. And he is essentially, bin Laden saw him and another individual as his teacher, his theologian, his mentor. What does Katab write, among many different things? And today some of it has been translated. I don't read Arabic, but I read it in the translation. He develops a whole philosophy. And you must know this philosophy if you want to understand these events. And what's most fascinating, you'll see it's completely based and understood in context of Judaism and Torah. And it's not about cowboys and Indians and bad guys and good guys, and we're just going to end it and the movie is over after 3 hours. It's not going to work exactly like that. So Katab basically states the philosophy, which is very, very basic, really mainstream Islam. The only thing is he calls for violence. And there may be different variations. But the principles that he writes are very much part of Muslim theology. And it goes like this. That God chose the Jewish people because they all accept the Bible. They all accept Abraham, God, the chosen people. Am hanivcher, banu v'charta. God chose the Jewish people to do what? To bring a divine spiritual presence into a materialistic, selfish world. A world that's driven by greed and self-interest, to bring a higher presence. And that's the Torah and the mitzvahs. But briefly put, Katab says the Jews failed to do so. They became sinful. And as a result, God chose next, He chose the Christians. Jesus, the Christians, that they should do the job. And they failed even worse. And then God, 700 years later, chose Muhammad, the prophet, and the creation of a new belief system called Islam. And Islam comes after Christianity, after Judaism, which is the best of all three. And the chosen people are now the Muslims, to do what the Jews did not succeed and the Christians did not succeed. And essentially he speaks that the Christians and the Muslims, the Christians and the Jews, that's why you'll hear so often they use words like the Zionist crusaders. Where's that coming from? Crusaders were the Christian warriors fighting for Jerusalem in the early 8th century, 12th century, those years. What are all these battles going on in the Middle Ages over what? Over Jerusalem. Between the Muslims and the Christians. Who's going to control the holy city? The Jews were already expelled and destroyed 2,000 years ago almost by the Romans. And they never had a chance. But the battles raged between the Christians and the Muslims. Why do you think the old city of Jerusalem has 4 quarters? There's a Jewish quarter, which was always, Jews dominated that city. Then there's a Christian quarter, and there's a Muslim quarter, and then there's an Armenian quarter, which is another discussion, how the Armenians suddenly got it. Some say it was to appease them after the genocide in the beginning of the 20th century, so they gave them a quarter. Whatever it was. They're British, that is. But regardless, this is Katab's philosophy. And he says what happened was the Muslims slowly began to grow with the Ottoman Empire, and the Muslims were the leaders in astronomy, mathematics, science, and of course religious beliefs. But the Western corrupt world of the conspiracy of the Jews and the Christians refused to accept Muslim rule, and therefore God's rule, and as such have corrupted. And with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the beginning of the 20th century, that humiliation was essentially the Western world recognizing that the Muslims are going to control the universe. Basically, they say they raped us, they stole our sciences, and they're trying to turn us into a third world country. But God blessed us with oil, so they can't do that so quickly. If we didn't have oil, all we'd have is camels and donkeys and deserts. And Kitab continues, and then he goes on with his virulent anti-Semitism. I mean, he says things that are so over the wall, but so far so good. If you read all this, you say, hey, this is an interesting philosophy and very seductive. A young person could be very impressionable, a young Muslim growing up, said, wow, the Muslims are now the chosen people to bring God to the world. But then he gets into that we have to do this with using all means at our disposal, including violent means. This is the teacher of bin Laden. This is one of the founders of the thinking behind ISIS, behind Hamas, behind Hezbollah, and so on. There are others. And I'm not going to go into a whole, it's not, you didn't come here to get a Muslim primer here. And not that I'm an expert either, and I don't want to be an expert, but I do want to understand what makes these people tick. So they're going on a religious war. And a religious war immediately, most Americans don't even want to hear about a religious war. We thought religious wars were over 500 years ago. But they're not over, my friends. And you got to realize that. This is religious war. So as tragic and as brutal it is to see the beheading of young innocent children by ISIS because they don't believe what they believe, I think there's one blessing in it all. So to speak, a blessing in disguise. That it's clarity. They're telling you straight out what they want. Muslims are supposed to control the world, not just the Middle East. And that's where they make the statement a few weeks ago. Last week they said in the White House will be a caliph. The Muslim flag will wave over the White House. So most of us think of it, okay, some type of crazies. It'll never happen. Yeah, it probably will not happen because we do have a strong army here. They're not suddenly control of the White House. But that is their vision. And they see it as a religious vision. They don't see it as a brutal vision. They don't see beheadings as brutal. They see the necessary thing you have to do in order to bring God's message in the world to a world of infidels, of non-believers, and of heretics. That's what they call. So they are indoctrinated. Don't look at them as children. Exactly what Nazis did. They dehumanized Jews first. First you dehumanize, you turn them into cockroaches. They're not significant. So then it's easier to kill them. Just like you'd kill an insect. That's exactly their mentality. And trust me, I'm not in any way trying to legitimize it. I'm just trying to put ourselves in their shoes. If they were sitting here, what would they say to you? So it's easy to just call them animals and beasts and let's just kill them all. By all means, absolutely, they should all be killed. Just for this alone. But don't think that they're coming out of nowhere. It's not just a bunch of savages. They're not cannibals that just want to eat human meat. They have a whole philosophy, as distorted as it may be. I don't know if you've ever read Nazi propaganda and Nazi philosophy. Nietzsche, that they base it on, and others about superhumans. A lot of it is extremely repulsive, but it's appealing for someone who's impressionable, who's ignorant, who wants to feel super special, who feels humiliated by his life. It's very appealing. That's why it's not surprising that they can attract so many young people. And if you look at the profiles, I'll take questions at the end. If you look at the profiles of the people that blew up the World Trade Center and so on, you'll see young people, educated. They weren't taken out of a prison and said, here, take an axe and go kill people. They were educated. They were reading documents. These documents were recovered from the hotel rooms they were at. And you could check it out online. It's not my theory here. It's not a conspiracy theory. It basically explains Muslim thinking. Now, I will tell you clearly, there's no question in my mind, there are millions of Muslims that don't agree with jihad in the literal sense of violence. And many are moderate, so to speak. But they still believe that Islam is the superior religion. Why shouldn't they? Just like Christians feel they're the superior ones. That's why you find, Islam is the fastest growing religion right now, especially in Africa. The biggest Muslim country, by the way, most people do not know, is Indonesia, actually. Because Muslims are not necessarily Arabs. and Arabs are not Muslims. Arabs are geographic. Muslims is religion. So you could have Muslim people that are not Arabs. You could have Arab Christians, for example. And you could have Muslims that are not Arab as well, Muslim Indonesians, for instance. You have Muslims in China, you have Muslims in Russia, and other places. Now, the Christians did exactly this, if not even worse, during the Middle Ages. They also buy the sword. What do you think the Crusaders did? And Jews were always at the brunt of it all, because Jews were the first, the oldest brother. And we were always the reminder that if the Old Testament is legitimate, why do you need a new one? So in a strange way, and nobody likes to say this, but I'll say it right up front here. If Judaism was the first, and it is the first, well, you all know that, and everyone admits that, then becomes a question, if as long as the Judaism is legitimate, how can Christianity and Islam really be that legitimate? Now, interestingly and ironically, I will tell you that I find them legitimate, because I'll tell you why. The goal is ultimately, the Jewish goal, the Torah, is giving of the Torah at Sinai, meant to come and transform the entire world. When Abraham taught chesed, tzedakah, and mishpat, kindness, virtue, and so on, he didn't just teach it for the Jews. He didn't just teach it to his son Isaac, he also taught it to his son Ishmael. And Isaac taught it to Esau just as he taught it to Jacob. He didn't say to Jacob, listen, you'll be the virtuous one, and Esau can be the warrior. Esau's nature happened to be a warrior. But Esau learned the principles from Isaac. You can imagine, Vayigla Na'arim, when they, as little children, they were listening to the same father. The father was teaching them Torah. He was teaching them what he learned from his father Abraham. Nevertheless, each one went on their own path. And the next step in the story goes that when God gave the Torah at Sinai, the Talmud tells us and the Medrash tells us that God turned to whom? To the children of Esau and to the children of Ishmael and offered them the Torah. What did they do? They said, let's see what it says in the contract, in the document, in the Constitution. Lo sitzach, no, that's not for me. Do not kill. I'm not ready to accept that. Lo sinaf, do not have sexual inappropriate behavior. We're not ready to accept that. And therefore the Torah ended up not being given to them. When it came to the Jews said, Nasav and Ishmael, we'll accept it all. The big question is, why did God offer it to them when he knew they wouldn't accept it anyway? Or maybe you better put, let's say they did accept it. What would have happened then? The Jewish people, just 210 years suffering in Egypt, they're the grandchildren of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and suddenly, hey, God offers it to other nations, they accept it. What will happen to the Jews? So what was the point? Well, God was not playing games. The Zohar has a tremendous, beautiful answer. It says, because God was actually preparing them to receive it one day. Because the purpose of the Torah and its system of virtue is not just for Jews. And ultimately, the Christians and the Muslims did embrace it in some way. Pagan nation, the Romans were, and ultimately the teachings of Judaism. And when I say Judaism, I don't mean being Jewish. I mean Judaism, the universal teachings of virtue and kindness and benevolence and so on, did penetrate the pagan world, and it turned when Constantine converted to Christianity, the great Roman Empire became Christian. And Muhammad did the same, bringing it to the pagan nations, to the pagan Arab world, the nomads in the Arabian Peninsula. And interestingly, both of them, the Christians and the Muslims, wanted the Jews to participate, and they refused, because the Jews already knew all this. We don't need your religion to teach us virtue. If anything, you're taking it from us. We're not taking it from you. But the Christians and the Muslims always saw the Jews as a pain in the butt, pardon the expression, actually much worse than that, because they always refused to go along with them. And that's when Muhammad, once he made his appeals to the Jews and they rejected him, he became an enemy. Same thing Martin Luther. What did Martin Luther do when Protestantism was born? He first came to the Jews and says, we're no longer going to be aggressive like the Catholics. We're a more liberal version, it's a more moderate version, etc. And when the Jews rejected him, he became worse anti-Semite than all the Catholics put together. But from a Jewish point of view, I should cite Maimonides, who writes in the end of Hilchos Malachim, in his book of laws, his magnum opus called the Mishnah Torah. He writes something unbelievable. I mean, I always marvel that a man could have come up with something like this, because it's amazing what he writes. It's interesting that it actually was taken out by the censors. So you don't find it in the regular Rambam today, because they censored those sections. But you have it in the early edition. Ironically, the edition that has the version that's complete is called the Tfus Remi, the Roman edition of the Rambam. So he writes the following. He writes beyond regardless of the flaws that may be in Christianity or Islam, the fact is that God, in His mysterious ways, allowed these religions to spread all over the world to billions of people, was because it helps prepare the world for understanding the ideas of the unity of God and the world of Mashiach. And they spread that message to, as he puts it, all over the earth, including distant islands. That's what Maimonides writes 1,000 years ago. When we're not living in a benevolent Western country like the United States. The Maimonides was living in very difficult times. And yet that's what he writes. Because the Jewish perspective is the following, that the world evolves and becomes a better and better place. And over the years, yes, the ideas that were given at Sinai, that initially was just embraced by a small group called the Jewish people, will ultimately permeate and affect the entire world. And the United States is a case in point. Read a book, if you like, called by Michael Novak. He's a scholar, not Jewish, Christian, writes a book called On Two Wings. I've mentioned it a number of times. It's an excellent book. It's not theories. He basically quotes all the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Paine and John Adams and so on. And he quotes them in their own words. And his subtitle of one of the chapters is The Basis of the American Constitution in the Metaphysics of Torah. He doesn't even call it the Bible. And he proves how they all were influenced not by Christian thought, but by Jewish thought to establish this country. And the principles of this, of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights are almost word for word from Torah thought. So here you have a country, after hundreds and hundreds of years of persecution of Jews and others by the Christians, a country founded by Christians, deists, however you want to define them, nevertheless they were Christians, a country based on principles that are very Jewish. This doesn't mean this country is perfect, it doesn't mean we live up to all the standards, but there's the basic principles of all men are created equal, and by inalienable rights, endowed to us by whom? By the Creator. I mean, you don't need to be a Torah scholar to know this is almost word for word from different Torah statements. Every human being created in the divine image. We all have certain rights. There's no person can ever be taken. There's no such thing as an inferior human being. Now you'd think today we take this for granted, but this was not for granted 400 years ago. Before the United States, before the Revolution, American Revolution, countries were ruled by monarchs or by the church based on their whims. If we had a benevolent despot, great. If you didn't, too bad. So here's a principle that took thousands of years. Literally thousands of years. Matan Torah was over 3,300 years ago. This country was founded 300 years ago. So it took almost 3,000 years for principles to finally saturate, and it has changed the world. So the fact that we still have plenty of problems, and you see that the wars are not over with, but Abraham's teachings that he taught not just Isaac but also Ishmael and Esau and Jacob ultimately have made their way into society. There's still work to be done, but it's changed. Things have dramatically changed. So when God offered Ishmael and Esau, the Bnei Ishmael and Bnei Esau, the children of Ishmael and Esau, the Torah, it was a Havamin, and Torah is also Torah. Meaning a consideration of God is also a consideration because he was paving the way that will ultimately affect the world. Now, I would say without a question in my mind, Islam today is where Christianity was in the 16th century, more or less. Maybe 15th century. It still hasn't matured. So it still uses aggressive means because they have not figured out to the mature approach how to bring God to the world. So they still do it in the ways that the Christians did it. The truth is, what's playing itself out right now in the battlefields of the Middle East is nothing new. And if you want even further, there's a sefer called, it's called Mayoneh Yeshua, from the Abarbanel, Don Isaac Abarbanel. He lived Gerish Sfard. He lived during the Spanish expulsion, which would mean 1492. What are we talking about now? 600 years ago, right? Something like that. Is that correct? Yeah, 600 would be 1992. Yeah, 600 and some and 10, 12, 15 years. He, huh? 1492 is 1500, the year 1500. Yeah, 500 and some years, okay. So we all know there was the golden age of the Jewish golden age in Spain, and then they were expelled, as was common in Europe in those days. And he writes in this sefer, it's an introduction to the book of Daniel. We know the book of Daniel is full of prophecies that are very cryptic about the future. The dream of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, etc. And he explains that the events, the battles going on then, because then there were also battles between the Muslims and the Christians. At that point, the Moors were controlling northern Africa and they were traveling. At that point, the Muslim empire reached all the way into Spain. And then there was, of course, the wars that went back and forth and the Crusades and all that. And explains it all goes back to the biblical battles between Ishmael and Esau. One thing that makes the plot thickens, an interesting twist, is that Esau married Ishmael's daughter. So there's a type of crossbreeding between the Western Christian world and the Muslim world. And there's a whole story behind that as well, but I won't go into it right now. The point I want to make is that the only way to understand events today is you have to go back and trace the steps to what was going on back then. It's just replaying itself in just another form. And frankly, most Americans, as I said, if this was a movie, maybe they'd like the plot, but don't like the reality of it because it takes us back to the Middle Ages. Who wants to hear about brutality, beheadings in the name of religion, ultimatums, either convert or die, etc., etc. But my friends, that's the reality right now on the ground. And though in the Gaza you don't hear by Hamas exactly the same ultimatum because they're not making such ultimatums with Israel, which is a dominant country with an army, but the philosophy is a similar one. And Israel, the Jews, remain an open wound for the Muslim world. The reason they cannot accept Israel, let's be honest, why can't they accept? They have so much land. Why can't they accept one little sliver of land called Israel for the Jewish people? Because to them it's a sacrilegious, it's a desecration of God's Muslim plan. If the Muslims indeed are the chosen people to transform the world, and Israel fell out of favor, Israel should not be in control. And most Muslims believe that. Some will say, now that Israel is existent, let's figure out how to live in peace with them. But most will say, you know what? We'll let Jews live, but hey, the control has to be Muslim. And many will say, if you just want a really reality check, which most people don't like to hear, I send a link to this to several people, they just don't want to watch it. Just get a selection. Someone just sent me a selection of the last 5 speeches given by imams in the last 5 Fridays in mosques across the Middle East. One was, and across Europe for that matter. One was in Gaza, one was in Qatar, one was in Rome, and one was in Berlin, and one was somewhere else in Europe. Just hear their speeches. They're in Memory. Memory.com has them all translated into English. You tell me, you read those speeches, I don't even want to repeat what they say. Literally calling for the extinction and the killing of every Jew all over the world. Not just in the West Bank, and not just in Tel Aviv, everywhere. Would this be tolerated if any Jewish leader said such a thing? And this is being preached week after week after week in a month. I don't know if there's a mosque where it's not preached. And you tell me this not to have impact on impressionable children? And nobody talks about this. This is not news. You don't hear it not in CNN. You don't even hear it on Fox. How come no one talks about this? This is being fed as we speak. If you study Nazi Germany, what was the propaganda being fed? There was propaganda being fed every day to children, men, women, and children in newspapers and so on. This is a big part of the battle. Because what are you going to do? You can fight wars all day, but right now they're being poisoned as we speak. So every generation you kill, there's another generation coming right afterwards, even if you kill them all. This is being toxifying minds poisoning them about Jews, about Israel, etc., etc. Again, this is uncomfortable facts, Well, I remember, what was his name, Moore, when he wrote that thing, inconvenient truth about the global warming or something. How come no one does any inconvenient truths about these type of ideas? So I don't know if you came here tonight to hear all this, but since I have the floor, and you waited anyway 45 minutes till we began, so I'm stating it because I think it's vital to have our eyes open, understand. And by the way, I'm not looking here to make any panic or cause any fears. On the contrary, I feel empowered when I hear about this because I understand it then. It makes sense to me. Now I understand what's going on. Put it in the biblical context. I remember reading a number of years ago in a newspaper. I won't tell you which newspaper. You can guess. It said the Jews do not deserve Israel because they're not ready to fight for it. The Arabs deserve it because they're ready to fight for it, because they feel it belongs to them. So who said this? So you think, Rav Kook, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, not the Satmar Rebbe, but this Rebbe, that Rebbe, Rabbi Soloveitchik. Who said this? This was a headline in an Al-Qaeda newspaper. I saw it translated. That the Jews don't deserve Israel because they're not ready to fight for it. Now, I think sometimes our enemies make us wise. You want to understand events, all you got to do is read their documentation, read their theories and their thoughts. So what does all this tell us? What all this tells us is that, my friends, this is an old story, nothing new. And as the Medrash says, that in the future, an Arab country will attack a Christian country. That's what it says. Literally what's happened in Iraq now. And the whole world will become an uproar. There'll be an uproar. And people will be afraid what's going to be. What provoked Obama to bomb ISIS in Iraq? Because they were slaughtering Christians. Christian Iraqis. There were 1.5 million Christians in Iraq. Now there's a few 100,000. They're stranded on the mountain there, some of them. So the Medrash says that in the future, an Arab country, a Persian country, you could even say, which is that area, Babylon, Iraq, modern-day Iraq, will attack Aram, which is the countries of the West, meaning Christian countries. And what will happen? People will be terrified. And the Jews, too, will be afraid. And they'll come running to God, and God will say, my children, don't be afraid. I've done all this for you. Because you should know Mashiach is coming. That's what it's a Medrash in Yalkut Shmeini. As a matter of fact, the Lubavitcher Rebbe cited it during the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Because that's what happened. Saddam Hussein, if you remember, attacked Kuwait, etc., etc. So the events then are just now 13 years later. I mean, 1991 is 23 years later, but events that are continuing to brew. And the bottom line is, their understanding of it is meant to help us, number one, realize that this is a long, old story. Number two, not to be afraid, because this is not part of the plan, but part of the maturity process. And if we really understood it well, if our leaders understood it well, they'd know how to deal with it. They'd figure out a way that you must tame the Muslim world, and you have to get to the root of it, how they're educating their children, because they're still teaching them these middle-age ideas. So when you have an imam in a mosque saying that every Jew has to be killed, he could say it's figurative, metaphorical. So why should it be surprising that you have a Hamas and ISIS and others that are ready to kill and behead other people? And as we all know, if you're going to kill the Jews, even non-Jews have already made the statement. If the Jews are being killed, rest assured that a little later everyone else is going to be attacked. Hitler didn't stop with the Jews. It always begins with the Jews. But if you think you're going to just target the Jews, it never works that way. It's like the miner's canary, as they say. It's a sign. If people can be unjust, injustice spills over to others as well, not just to the Jewish people. So to me, when I saw the ISIS happening in Iraq, and the United States feels compelled to attack them, while literally in the wake of the events in Gaza, I said, this is God's hand. God's hand waking up America to do something which Obama would never have. He criticized every type of intervention in Iraq, and now he's bombing the place. And we all know it's not going to be just bombing. Once you're in, you're in. It's not going to be so easy to extricate yourself. All this while events are taking place in Gaza. So to me, this was the full moon rising. By no means, every death, whether Jew or non-Jew, is a tragedy for us. When the Egyptians who were like Nazis, who perpetrated genocide against the Jewish people back then in Egypt, and slave labor, and then not only that, once they let the Jews go, they still couldn't deal with that, and they came pursuing them, and that's when they drowned in the Red Sea. So the Talmud says that the angels began to say praise. They praised God for the killing of these wicked people. You know what God said? My creatures are perishing and you're singing praise. Because for a Jew, every death, even a justifiable one, is a tragedy. Blood is blood. Every one of the 7 billion people on this planet was created in the divine image by God, including Muslims, including Christians, including Hamas too. So we cry for every death, and we cry that people can stoop to a point where they can have such hatred and just attack for no other reason simply because we're Jewish. It's not like we celebrate. But at the same time, we're also not naive. An enemy is an enemy, a declared enemy is a declared enemy, and the only way is to be decisive. You know, why at the end of World War II did the Allies demand unconditional surrender from the Germans and the Japanese? You already bombed their cities. Hiroshima and so on. They've been humiliated, they were already lost, they already clearly were conquered. So let them save some face, call it conditional surrender. Let them feel No. Because when a war where millions of people, innocent people were died because you were the perpetrators, there has to be a clear winner and a clear loser. And if you don't have a clear winner and a clear loser, and you allow the loser to even give them 1% of thinking that they have some type of victory, you're creating disaster. Unfortunately, which is another discussion, this is what happened after the 6-Day War in Israel. But I'm not going to go into that right now. You know, and you have to, at the same time that we cry for every death, Jew or non-Jew, we have to also be clear about standards, and we have to be clear, we have to be decisive. So all the events going on right now, and hopefully they'll be over with, and we don't have to have any suffering, and no losses, and no deaths, and no fears. But I don't think that's happening so fast, because you're talking about, as I said, a combustion chamber. I mean, eruptions there can happen any second, anything can happen. But clarity of understanding that this is a religious battle. And our response is not just leave us alone, or we'll kill you all you Indians. The response is that Israel, leading the way, should be the spiritual agents, and saying, you want to know what God wants? I'll tell you what God wants. Abraham, our father, our mutual father, the father of Islam and the Christianity of Jews, what did Abraham teach? Kindness. You bring God to the world through kindness. What did Abraham do when he met infidels? When he met infidels, what did he do? He didn't behead them. He didn't kill them. He didn't pursue them. You know what he did? He prayed for them. You know who the infidels were? Sodom. The city of Sodom. What happened when Abraham heard that Sodom was going to be destroyed? He should have celebrated. He should have been the first to come with an axe and behead them all. He said to God, people will say that the judge of the entire universe is not doing justice. He's basically declared and said, maybe there's a righteous person there. He begged God for compassion. I don't understand why Abraham's grandchildren called Muslims, including the ISIS and all these others, why don't they study their own grandfather? This is the message we should be bringing to the world. Now, this doesn't mean we have to be religious leaders, but this is, whether it's President Obama or whether it's President or Prime Minister Netanyahu, this is the message. You want to talk? We'll talk your language. You want to talk about God? We have something to say about what God wants. And you have to demand that they start teaching their children a more benevolent version of what God wants. And this battle is an ideological one. Unfortunately, it spills over into armies and rockets and missiles and tunnels, etc., etc. So, my friends, I'd say the following. As we come from Tisha B'Av, the saddest day, the word of, Salah writes, is an acronym for Edom, Bavel. The two nations that destroyed the first and second temple. Bavel, Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, who Saddam Hussein modeled himself after. And of, Aleph, Edom, is Rome. The Romans who destroyed the temple number 2. That's the destruction of. But then comes Tu B'Av, the full moon of, which teaches us that nothing can vanquish us. The temples were destroyed, yes, but we're still standing. We're here thousands of years later. And that's the message right now. As we come from the ashes of Tisha B'Av, we rebuild. And this will now feed the next month called Elul, that we coming in a few weeks. As the Shalah also writes, that the month of Av has a mazel. The sign of Av is Aryeh, Leo. Aryeh is an acronym for Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Hoshana Rabbah. So out of the ashes of Av, Aryeh, of the month of the lion that destroyed, gives birth to the most compassionate month and to the high holidays, to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, all the way to the end of Sukkot. Because we don't believe of destruction as an end in itself. Every down leads to a greater ascent, as I mentioned before. So, though I'm here right now in the United States, but the moon is full. Last night and 2 nights ago, they say it's the largest moon of the year, the most romantic moon. So the moon, I think right now, when they were fighting in Gaza 2 or 3 weeks ago, they had to use all these flares because it was dark. The moon was not there. Now the full moon is shining over Gaza and over Iraq and over all those countries with its haunting glow. And it's a sign, a message from above. That God is saying, even though there's challenges, remember you have the full moon that I send you. And we have to be wise and appreciate it and bring this message to the world. Because we are, at the end of the day, when I say we, the Jewish nation, are the oldest one of them all. We were here from the beginning. And we can convey what Abraham really taught. And just as the Christians ultimately were tamed, at least most of them, I would say all of them at this point, so too can the Muslims. Their religion has many beautiful ideas that come from Torah. But the idea that God needs violence is absolutely abhorrent. Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, the great sage, when he came out, 12 years he had to hide from the Romans because they decreed no one's allowed to study and teach Torah, and he was doing that. So he hid in a cave. When finally he came out, it was after 12 years of such refined isolation, he was so sublime and so refined that wherever he walked, the Talmud says, started burning. Because when he saw the pettiness of people involved in all kinds of mundane and menial things, it began to burn, physically, metaphorically. So God says to Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, you're not mature enough. Go back 1 more year into the cave, a 13th bar mitzvah year, and come back. And after 1 more year, Rashbi came back, and wherever he went, he was masakin. Wherever he saw a problem, he created a tikkun, he fixed it. So you think, which is more a greater spiritual level? The one that burns up the world with his spiritual intensity, or the one that repairs the world? And this is the stages in life. Ishmael Pera Adam was Abraham's child, and Lu Yichi Ishmael Lefanav, Abraham prayed for him. But at the same time, Ishmael didn't understand one important message. The way to bring the divine to this world is not through the sword and not through aggression. It's going to be ultimately through kindness, through compassion, through tiferes. Esau too was the son of Isaac, but he went with the path of the warrior. Ishmael Chama, the sword, as the Christians later did in the years of the Crusades and so on. And that too had to be tamed. And so that's where we are. And when we understand this well, it becomes something that we can derive lessons, first of all, in our own personal lives. When we too sometimes are aggressive, maybe in the name of God or in the name of our beliefs, and you have to realize that the way to transform the world is to repair it, not to burn it up, not to destroy. So this is some context over events that are taking place now. I hope to talk about some more, but ultimately the end story is that the world will come to recognize, as that Yalkut Shmeini says, don't be afraid, that ultimately all these are stepping stones to a world of harmony and peace, when all the nations will come to understand that the way to have a relationship with God is through peaceful ways. We still live in a place in a world where some people say the only solution is to get rid of religion altogether. Religion is the cause of all our problems. Or we have the other extreme, religion by the sword. Judaism teaches is you can have a God and a peaceful God. You don't have to get rid of religion, and you don't have to have it aggressive. You have to find that middle ground, Tiferes, that Yaakov mastered. Tiferes Zumat and Torah. A middle ground, Shalom Ba'elam. Kol HaTorah le'nitna ela lasa Shalom Ba'elam. The Torah came to bring peace to the world. So I hope this was somewhat a little illuminating. about some of the events. And as I say, there's a lot more to be said. This is somewhat of a summary, and I hope to write about it and speak about it some more. And I want to say a blessing to all of us. First of all, Israel and all nations. All should finally discover, make their peace with God, and find the right path that does not require one person killing another person who's also created in the divine image. We should only have Shalom al Yisrael. Thank you very much. And until next week, Wednesday, Philip will not be giving his class tomorrow night. Until September, he's away. But we will continue next Wednesday. And everyone have a very pleasant and a peaceful week. And make sure you share some good words with our brothers and sisters in Israel. Show solidarity. If you can make it there, it's even better. But you can make a phone call, an email, and other ways. And everyone, God bless you all. Thank you.